On page 232, where it says 341 at the bottom, the heaviest weight. What if one day or one night a demon slinked after you into your loneliest loneliness and said to you, "This life, as you live it, now and as you have lived it, you will have to live once more and countless times more. And there will be nothing new about it, but every pain and every pleasure and every thought and sigh and everything unspeakably small and great in your life must come back to you, and all in the same series and sequence, and likewise this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and likewise this moment and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned over again and again, and you with it, you mote of dust." I just love he's such a magnificent writer. Wouldn't you throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and damn the demon who spoke this way? Or have you ever experienced a prodigious moment in which you would answer him, "You are a god, and I have never heard anything more godlike"? If that thought took control of you, it would change you as you are, and maybe shatter you. The question in each and everything, do you will this once more and countless times more, would lie as the heaviest weight upon your acts? Or how benevolent would you have to become toward yourself and toward life in order to long for nothing more ardently than for this ultimate eternal sanction and seal? What's he saying? He's saying, look, what if I told you that you're going to have to live your life over again an infinite number of times? The same things are going to recur endlessly, over and over again. So each choice you make, you have to weigh, do I want to do this over and over again? As Woody Allen once put it, does this mean I have to sit through the ice capades again? Yes, everything will happen.
Does anybody remember the movie Groundhog Day?
That's exactly, it's an illustration of the eternal recurrence principle. Well, everything eternally recurs on television. This is one of the characteristics of postmodern popular culture. There's the Flintstones, and then there's the Flintstones, the movie. Everything is recycled. We're constantly recycling our own excrement. This is the way that popular culture works. But eternal recurrence is a strange thought, because it can have two possible effects on you. It can be a terribly depressing thought, or a terribly liberating thought. And depending on the reaction, it separates out two types of human beings. The presupposition of the eternal recurrence principle is that every life is pretty much a mixed bag, and there are lots of things you'd never want to do again. And then the question is, well, how is it that you can be eager to do everything again? How can this be a liberating thought? Well, it can only be a liberating thought if you're willing to simply pronounce that everything you've ever done is good, and accept it. Now, how can you do that? Well, you have to be one of these free spirits that basically says, enough of this moral brooding, okay? Enough of this concern with the moral values of our actions. My life is good simply because I say it is good, and therefore I can live it over and over again eternally. Okay? Those are the kinds of people who will be invigorated by this. And these are the kinds of people that Nietzsche calls the active nihilists. Nihilism just means nothingism. And nihilism means that if you're a nihilist, you don't recognize the ultimate truth or reality of anything, including values. There's no order above you that constrains you. Just a sec. Let me just get this other half of this thought out, and then we'll go back. Nihilism, again, is the denial of any objective order that constrains you in thought or action. An active nihilist is a person who finds this invigorating and treats this as a great source of possibility, and is willing to put the stamp of approval on their life, dross and all, ice capades and all. Okay? They're willing to say it's good. And that means that they can't recognize any prior standards of goodness over and above their own will and judgment. Now, the passive nihilist is the person who, when they hear about the eternal recurrence idea, just thinks, oh God, I'm going to have to sit through the ice capades again. They may not be morally ambitious or earnest or idealistic sorts, but they're still constrained by the moral judgment of their actions and their lives. They still think that what I've done is bad or worthless or regrettable or a waste of time. They're not willing to throw off any external standards and simply assert the goodness of existence. Now, the eternal recurrence is a brilliant kind of thought experiment, because what it does is it invigorates the active nihilist. Not only is everything they've done good? They'll do it infinitely. It's a kind of immortality. Whereas the passive nihilist finds this extremely depressing. I'm going to have to go to Aunt Martha's again. I'm going to have to go through my senior prom again. And on and on. Every disaster that you can think of. You think about doing that again. You can't think that these things are good. You can't will to believe these things are good, and therefore you just find it a depressing thought. Well, what's the outcome of this idea? Well, for the active nihilist, it's invigorating. For the passive nihilist, it's depressing and demoralizing, which raises the active nihilist's power in the world by, in a sense, demoralizing anybody who might oppose him. And Nietzsche teaches this thought because it's a tool, again, a tool for the disillusion of a rotted order and the encouragement of the kinds of people who would bring something new about. This is why I think that Nietzsche has to ultimately appeal on some level to some sort of criterion, and that criterion has everything to do with his sense of the health of the soul. When he thinks that it's bad for God to die because that's a kind of collapsing inward and constriction of the soul, that presupposes some notion of the health of the soul. Yet in this very text that we read, he attacks this whole concern, says, sickness isn't so bad either. We should taste all the different things of life. And by sickness of the soul, he means evil. Virtue is the health of the soul. That means vice is its sickness. Well, he says taste everything. But the fact is that he presupposes some model of human health. There are different types of humans and therefore different types of health, but he does presuppose some kind of model in order to generate his value judgments here, or we just take it as arbitrary, in which case, he's no better than any undergraduate relativist that I've encountered. In some ways, he doesn't talk like one. The things he says are very relativistic, but the way he says them certainly are.
Very sure.
He's very sure of himself. And there is something peculiar about that, there's no question. And this is why I think that on some level on the surface Nietzsche says things are good because we say they are. Whereas on a deeper level I think he presupposes that there are some things good in and of themselves, which is interesting. Nietzsche's presupposing with this eternal recurrence thing that everybody's got something to regret. If there really were a human being who didn't have anything to regret, well, they wouldn't be a nihilist for wanting to live eternally. They would just, they would be able to say, my life is good, not because I say it's good, because it measures up to whatever standard of goodness I've accepted from outside me. And you're in a happy position if you're in that state. It's kind of hard to think of anybody who has no regrets in that sense. So a life without regrets for him is a life that we simply refuse to regret by casting off any standards by which we would judge ourselves or our actions regrettable. And that is nihilism, because it's saying, I recognize nothing above my own will. There's nothing outside of me. There's nothing above me. That's the sense in which he's a nihilist. But if you can be an active nihilist, that means that although you recognize nothing above you, you can certainly impose certain things on those below you. You can be above somebody else, looking down and imposing a new order and discipline upon them. This is why Nietzsche's always talking about, we need warrior spirits. And he looked forward to the 20th century as a world of global wars and struggles. And he was quite prophetic in this, but he hoped that something new would emerge from all of this chaos. The Hindus have this notion of the cycles of time, the 4 ages, right? And Vico, who is a Western philosopher, has a cyclical view of history, and really Nietzsche has a cyclical view too. Civilizations arise out of barbarism. Barbarians are unself-conscious people, and their very unself-consciousness makes it possible for them to deeply and enthusiastically believe things. They have gods, in other words, and they have values, and they create great things. On the basis of their enthusiastic and naive barbarism, they create great civilizations. These civilizations allow people a lot of leisure time and freedom. At least at the top, these people start getting reflective. They start thinking, I'm not what I do. I'm more than that. I'm a free spirit. Free spirits spread throughout society. People no longer identify with their roles and tasks. They feel alienated from the central values of the society. The gods die. Everything slowly begins a decline. And then you go back to barbarism again. Everything collapses eventually. You go back to the jungles. and new barbarians appear, and the cycle begins over again. This is how civilizations are born and die. This is how the world ends, right? We all just sort of whimper out, and a new civilization starts. But, Vico has this notion of, there's the age of gods, age of heroes, age of men. And the age of gods is the age of healthy barbarians, healthy, naive barbarism. Then there's the age of heroes, which is the peak of the civilization, where all of the values that are engendered in the age of gods by these healthy, naive barbarians give rise to the most beautiful flowering of culture. This is the heroic age. Then there's the age of men. This is the age of self-reflection, alienation. Vico calls this the barbarism of reflection. It's the age in which God dies. Gods die, values die out. It's the age of the last man, according to Nietzsche. The fourth stage is a process of dissolution. Everything dissolves. Everything falls apart, and then you go back to the beginning. The Hindus call this fourth age the Kali Yuga. James Joyce, in Finnegan's Wake, appropriates this four-age scheme. He calls the first age the age of God's egg burst, egg blend, egg burial, and hatch as hatch can. Now, all of this has to do with Vico, because Vico argues that the primordial institutions of the age of gods have to do with burial and the gods, and he argues that the divine comes about through terror, and he gives this wonderful little myth about primitive men walking around through the woods, and suddenly a big storm comes, and there's a cloud burst, and the thunder strikes them into awe, and they speak spontaneously the name Jove. Jove is the first word, and it's a name, and it refers to a god. And so the gods are born from the thunder burst, and then the egg blend. Well, it's the gods' funerals and the family. So egg blending, I guess, refers to intercourse or something. And of course, hatch as hatch can just refers to every man for himself as everything falls apart. It's not really reincarnation, because nothing transmigrates from one stage to the other. It's just everything happens all over again. The argument he gives for this is very peculiar. He says basically that there are a finite number of possible combinations of the material elements of the cosmos. There's an infinite expanse of time, and there's a principle that causes everything to rearrange constantly. Now, if you presuppose there's a finite combination of the elements of the cosmos, an infinite period of time, and a principle of constant change, then eventually everything that has happened will recur again and again exactly in the same way. It might take very long spans for everything to move through one cycle, but since there's an infinite time, everything that you've sat through this class an infinite number of times already, but since there's no transmigration, we have no way of knowing that until Nietzsche told us. There's no personal immortality in the sense of the soul surviving death, but since we are born and die an infinite number of times, we're all around forever. That would be the age of heroes, the heroic age. For him, in Christendom, that would have been the Middle Ages. Age of the Crusades and the great cathedrals. Most pious time. And really, the Renaissance was the process of decline. Before that, the Romans had their heroic age, and the Greeks had their heroic age.